The Bible is an incredible gift that God has given us to know not just about Him and His plan, but to learn about ourselves. And it's a really valid book. It fits together. It's got real history in it. It has lessons for us. It's a valuable thing. And to constantly see the foundations, people attempting to cut the foundations, it drives me insane. And I try to bring out some of the different things so that we know something we already know, but we know it on a more intellectual level as well, that the Bible's a reliable and valid book. And when you look through it and you pay attention to it, it's got a lot of things to say. So I'm just going to assume that your foundations are strong and cut out some of the maybe stuff that might seem extracurricular, but there's just so many great things in there. And speaking of that, we can think about our passage today. You know, there's only 4 verses here, but there's so many things that are taught to us by Mark in this short section. Let me pray together. I'll read it and then we could take a look at it. Father, thank you so much for your word. It's such a valuable gift to us. I pray that you would help us to have insight from the Spirit of God, to be able to see, to understand, to remember, and most of all, I pray for strength from the Spirit of God to live out the truths that we learn. Help us to learn these things so that we might better understand you and might grow more like you. And I ask you these things in the name of our Messiah. Amen. Mark chapter 2, verses 18 to 22, Mark writes this. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and said to him, "Why did John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "While the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment. Otherwise the patch will pull away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear results. No one puts new wine in old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." So let's look at the first beginning of this little story here. Verse 18, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and said to him, "Why did John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Well, in this first opening, we don't know exactly who they are, but they come to Jesus and they ask him a question. And there's 3 groups of people that we have here. We have John's disciples, who were followers of John the Baptist, and we have the Pharisees. Now, you're probably more familiar with the Pharisees because there's a lot more written about them, but we could look a little bit at John's disciples. But one thing I want to say in discussing the Pharisees is that most of the time you hear how horrible they are. And it's true. Majority of Pharisees were antagonistic to Jesus. They saw him as a threat to their position in the religious community, and they resented it. They saw the control of Jewish leadership and relationship with God, and as guardians of the community, slipping out of their hands and going over to Jesus, and they were intensely, incredibly jealous about it. So much so that ultimately they desired to see him dead. But here, we see the negative part of the Pharisees, but not every Pharisee was that way. And one real clear example was Nicodemus. He was a Pharisee. Many people believe Joseph of Arimathea, who provided the grave for Jesus when he died, was also a Pharisee. There were some Pharisees who listened. But in general, they were antagonistic because it threatened their personal position. But we don't often talk about the followers of John the Baptist. And it seems odd that they would be lumped together in with the Pharisees, because they certainly weren't antagonistic to the ministry of Jesus, but they're lumped in together in this case. Why were the disciples of John the Baptist fasting? Well, when this story occurred, John the Baptist was already in prison. And he was held in one of the 3 fortresses that Herod had. It was called Machaerus. And Machaerus was all the way on the other side of the Galilee in today what is now Jordan. It's about 90 miles from Capernaum, where Jesus and the disciples are, where he's asked this question in Capernaum. John is 90 miles away. And I looked it up. I'm trying to find some major point 90 miles from Phoenix. I couldn't do it. Tonopah was about as big as I could get. But it literally is the distance from here to Tonopah. It's quite a distance, especially if you're walking. So John is put in Machaerus. Would have been at least a 4 or 5 day journey each way to get there. Remember in the story of Abraham and Isaac, it said that he walked 3 days. It was a 60-mile journey. So even assuming they're going 20 miles a day, you're talking at least 4.5 days just to go there. So John's taken away from them. His disciples naturally were concerned about John. I mean, they really liked him. They followed him. They were out in the wilderness with him. They saw him, and now he's taken a 5-day journey away. We know that John's disciples traveled back and forth to see him. That's how much they cared about him. Remember in Matthew, when John is in prison, and you have to understand the mindset. Remember, John's imprisoned and he begins to doubt whether Jesus is really the Messiah or not. He starts to wonder about it, and you could understand. I mean, first of all, John really never saw the miracles of Jesus. He baptized Jesus, and then Jesus went off to his ministry, and John stayed out baptizing the people. He never saw the works of Jesus. So that might have caused a little question. He's taken 90 miles away, which in those days, as I mentioned, was a 4 or 5 day journey. He's by himself in a prison, and I don't know if you've ever been to Jordan, on the other side of the Galilee. It's like Phoenix in the summer. So here he is in an unconditioned cell, not any constant fellowship, visitors, food. Who knows what's going through his mind? And John begins to wonder about these things. So what happens? Here's how we know there was contact between John and his disciples. It says, Matthew 11, "Now while John was imprisoned, he heard about the works of Jesus. He sent word by his disciples, and they said to him, 'Are you the expected one, or should we look for someone else?' And Jesus answered and said, 'Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them.'" So we know there's contact between John's disciples and John, even though he's put away, because John sends his disciples back to Jesus, and he says, "Hey, are you really the one?" And what does Jesus say? "Just tell him the things I'm doing." And they go back and they tell John, which encourages him. So there's still this contact. They were concerned about John. They loved John, and John is in jail. And they are fasting, and they are praying for the release of John. His welfare was heavily on their mind. And Jesus, in the midst of their disciples, and we know the disciples, John's disciples were there, they're fasting, and Jesus and his disciples are feasting. We talked about the feast that Matthew gave him when he's feasting with the tax collectors. Everybody knew about it. So you have the Pharisees that are fasting, you have John's disciples that are fasting, and you have Jesus who's feasting. This certainly was a weird picture to them. I'm certain that John's disciples struggled with this whole concept. I mean, they followed John. And John tells them to follow Jesus. And while they are fasting for their leader, Jesus is having a feast. And I think that would have been really hard to deal with. I mean, How do you put those different things together? John's disciples had a real hard time trying to understand it. And in the middle of this, the Pharisees are there. Pharisees are already antagonistic to Jesus, but they see the opportunity to drive a wedge between John's disciples and Jesus. They take advantage of it because they start to talk to John's disciples and say, is this guy really supposed to be from God? Supposed to be a godly man? I don't think they got to the point that he was the Messiah yet, but certainly representative of God. How could somebody who loves God be having a good time while your friend is suffering in jail? I think that really played on their mind. How can he be good? How much does he really care about what you're going through? I thought, that's so true. I know exactly how that feels, and I know that you do too. How many times in your life have you thought to yourself, why does God do that? Why doesn't God do something about this? I mean, he's good. We know he's good, but he doesn't seem to be doing anything. Doesn't seem to care. So these guys were really struggling with this, and the Pharisees are driving this wedge in and causing more antagonism, and John's disciples are a little confused by it. So we have them fasting for an obvious reason. They're concerned about John. Well, why were the Pharisees fasting? Because that was the claim. They fast, John's people fast. Why would they fast? Well, we know from the Gospels that in general, the Pharisees liked to have outward shows of holiness. They wanted people to know they were holy. It was an external thing. It was a way for them to earn righteousness with God. It was almost like they could present a bill to God. I have done this and this and this for you, and now you need to do something for me. Even today in traditional Judaism, there's the concept of mitzvot, which literally means good works. And that's one of the ways that you earn your way to God. You do your good works, and it gets you closer and closer. And it's not just Judaism that believes that. I mean, I grew up as a Catholic, and I know that there's all different interpretations in Catholicism, but in general, the bottom line, when people come, it's kind of the idea of the scale. Like you want to do good and bad, and you get before God, and you hope when the scale's brought out that goes to the good. And in order to make ourselves be comfortable with that, we always compare ourselves to somebody who's no good. And they ain't going. But I stand a chance because I haven't done what they do. So I have a chance. And that's pretty much true in every religion outside of true biblical Christianity. There's that earning and working your way to God or the universe or whatever it is. It depends upon you how far you really can get. And the Pharisees fasted for a similar reason. They wanted respect from people to be considered holy, and they also wanted to earn acceptance with God. Now, in the Old Testament, there's only one commanded fast, and that was the day of Yom Kippur. It was a national fast day. There were no other days that were commanded as fasts. People would fast many times. We see that, but they were not commanded. But the Pharisees expanded on the one-day concept. And they had, on a regular basis, a 2-day fast. They would fast on Monday and Thursday. And the reason they did is because they thought that was the day that Moses went to Mount Sinai to get the second tablets of the law. Remember the first time Moses goes up to Mount Sinai for 40 days, and while he's up there, things happen down in the camp, and they start to have a problem and think that Moses isn't coming back, and they go to Aaron and tell him, Moses isn't coming back. We're out here in the desert. What are we going to do? And Aaron says, I have a great idea. Bring me all your gold. And he takes the gold and he fashions it into the golden calf. Moses comes down from the mountain. He sees, it says the people were playing. And you can interpret that in a million different ways, but it ain't good. That's the bottom line. And Moses comes down, he's so upset and angry that these people whom God has rescued out of the land of Egypt have so quickly turned to worship an idol that he took the commandments on stone and he broke them on the mountain. There was punishment because of the act. Moses goes back up the second time. He gets the second tablets of the law written. And he only stayed there a short period of time. And the Pharisees believed he went up on a Thursday, came back on a Monday, so they would fast those 2 days. And it happened regularly. Remember, last week we talked about the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And the Pharisees telling God how much better he is than the tax collector. And one of the things he mentions is, I fast twice a week. And that's what he's referring to, these two fasts. So when it says that the disciples of John were fasting, obviously they were concerned about their leader. The Pharisees were fasting. Most likely this happened on a Thursday or Monday, on a regular fast day. So they come and they ask this story, and it's a legitimate question. And Jesus gives his response. And as always, Jesus' response takes a little bit of thought. Jesus said to them, while the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast. So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. Now he gives what would have been a well-understood analogy. A wedding in Jewish culture in the time of Jesus lasted for 7 days. So imagine having to pay for that. 7 days. You got 3 or 4 girls, not such a great thing. 7-day feast. And the rabbinic tradition said you could not fast during that time. It was a time of joy, no matter who you were, Pharisee, Sadducee, anybody. There was no fasting during the wedding. It was a time of joy. They were commanded to rejoice. It was regarded as a religious duty to gladden the hearts of the bride and the bridegroom. What Jesus tells these questioners is, when the bridegroom is with you, you can't fast. Forbidden. What he likens himself to is the bridegroom. It's unusual in the sense that in the entire Old Testament, the Messiah is never referred to as a bridegroom. God is referred to as the bridegroom. And his bride is Israel. In this picture, Jesus makes himself be the bridegroom. And we know through other teaching and other books of Scripture that the church is the bride of the Messiah. And here he points out that he is the bridegroom. It's unusual because I remember Mickey and I were talking about the deity of Jesus. And many times people deny that Jesus was fully God and fully man. That's a real popular thing today. He's in the, I don't know, what's like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's in the Religious Leaders Hall of Fame. You know, you got Buddha, you have Mohammed, you got Jesus. You know, one of the stars voted in. Oh, Jesus is totally different because he's not just a man. He's fully God as well. And people say that he never said that, but he did. He said and did so many things. And this is another small example, but it is a point. The only person referred to as the bridegroom was God. And here Jesus takes that title on himself. His listeners would have been well aware of that fact. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. In his time, the rabbinic idea was that the time of the Messiah was like a wedding. Just like there's that week set apart to celebrate, there was a week in the history of the world when the Messiah would be here. It was kind of likened to that as a wedding. And Jesus announces the beginning of the wedding week, so to speak, when he's at the synagogue in Nazareth. I'm going to read you this section from Luke. I know you've heard it. And he came to Nazareth, Jesus, where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. He opened the book, technically, probably unrolled the scroll, and came to the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And all the eyes in the synagogue were fixed on him. Remember, we spoke one time about the synagogue and the way the synagogue was set up. There were the rows of people on the side and everything happened in the center. It was kind of like the theater in the round. So what Luke says is that Jesus gets up, he reads this messianic portion in the scripture, he sits down, and it says all the eyes in the synagogue were on him. And then it said, he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." It's the beginning of the week of the Messiah, the beginning of the wedding week. Jesus announces it. John the Baptist himself also mentioned it. In John chapter 3, when John introduces Jesus to the world, it says in 28 and 29, John says, "You yourselves are my witnesses that said, I am not the Messiah. I have been sent ahead of him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine has been made full." So John announces Jesus as the bridegroom, and Jesus takes that title. And they said, "Hey, why don't you guys fast?" He said, "Listen to me. You know from your own culture, you don't fast when the bridegroom's with you. It's a time of rejoicing." And that's what he tells them. We're rejoicing because I'm here, because it's the week. It was the wedding week of the Messiah. It would be inconsistent for his disciples to fast. It would have been forbidden even for them to fast. So he lets his questioners know, but he also tells them that this is not a permanent situation. Jesus says in the next verse, "But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day." Jesus tells them now is a time of rejoicing because the bridegroom is here, but the day will come when the bridegroom will, and literally, be violently taken away from them. It's a clear reference to us in hindsight. I mean, obviously he's referring to his death and his crucifixion. I don't believe that anybody that was listening to him could have any idea of what he was talking about. This is actually the first reference in the Gospel of Mark to the death of Jesus. The first. These guys would have no idea, the very beginning of the ministry of Jesus. The bridegroom's here, we're fasting, but they will come and the bridegroom will be violently taken away. I don't think anybody had the idea of that. And as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about the deity of Jesus. How could Jesus have known this if he didn't know the future? How could he have described the event so accurately, so clearly? Something that we look back in hindsight, oh yeah, there was a lot of feasting, there was a lot of rejoicing when he was here, but he was violently taken away. And then his followers will mourn. That's what happened. In the very beginning, you remember the disciples ran, they hid, they were shattered. Their whole world was shattered. They thought that Jesus had come as the Messiah. He was killed. It was over. They were discouraged. They were hiding out in a room in Jerusalem. It was the end to them because he had been violently taken away from them. So I think it's true that Jesus does show his divinity all throughout the Gospels, if you're willing to take a look and to see. Who else knows the end from the beginning? It's only spoken of about God, but here Jesus clearly knew. And then, to make the point of what he's trying to say, because they might miss the whole thing, the whole idea of fasting and the purpose of all these things, he gives them two little pictures, word pictures. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment, otherwise the patch pulls away from it. The new from the old, and a worse tear results. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the skins will burst, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. Talks about a very simple picture. You don't sew up an old piece of cloth with a piece you haven't washed yet. Because if you do, the new piece will shrink and you have a worse problem than you started with. Instead of having one tear, now you have 4 tears in the garment. That's what he's trying to tell them. It doesn't fix the hole, it makes it bigger. And he says you can't put new wine into old wineskins. In the time of Jesus, they would allow the wine to ferment inside the intestines of an animal. And when they did that, while it was fermenting, it would produce gas and expand. The new intestines were soft and supple, and they could expand as the wine fermented. Once they had expanded, that was it. They became brittle. So if you use those old wineskins again and the wine started to ferment, it would burst the wineskins. It could not contain the wineskins. So Jesus tells them that. It's very clear. He said, and he's talking here specifically about Judaism, but it applies to every single world religion outside of biblical Christianity. Jesus cannot be added on to any existing system. The system bursts. You can't say, we have this and this and this, put Jesus in the mix. It doesn't work that way. He is the new wine. He is the new cloth. And he brought with him a new covenant because the old could not contain it. The covenant that he brought was prophesied about by Jeremiah. Jeremiah said, "Behold, the days are coming when I will bring a new covenant." Jesus proclaimed this new covenant at the Last Supper, at the Passover Seder before his death. He picked up the cup and he said, "This cup is the cup of my blood, which is the seal of the new covenant." It was a new covenant, a new arrangement. There was the covenant of Moses, the old covenant. There's the covenant of Messiah, the new covenant. There was nothing wrong with the covenant of Moses, not disparaging the law of Moses or the Old Testament in any way. But the covenant of Moses was never meant to be a permanent situation. It was meant to fill in between the time it was given until the time that the Messiah came. Moses brought the covenant with him. The Messiah brought a new covenant with him. When Messiah fulfilled all the qualifications of the old covenant, he was allowed to bring in a new covenant. Let me give a little picture of how that kind of works. A simple theological picture, because I know there are still people today who give credence to the covenant of Moses. And I have 1,000% respect for the covenant of Moses. It's the Word of God. It's given to us. Paul tells us the laws were given to us to be a teacher. But it was not meant to be a permanent way that we have a relationship with God. And in order for the old covenant to be taken care of, for Jesus to bring in the new covenant, he had to fulfill the qualifications of the old covenant before it had to be removed. That's why Jesus, when the Pharisees said to him, they asked him about this, and he said, "I didn't come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it." I think a simple picture for me is the idea of having a mortgage on your house. You have the mortgage on your house, and one day, this happened to us. My wife was very hard to convince, but I said, "I think we should do a refi. We can get some better terms." And we talked about it. Long story short, we did the refi. And when you do the refi, what's the first thing they do? You don't really get the money. What happens is that they pay off the old loan, right? That's what happens with the refi. Because if they don't pay off the old loan, you still owe the old loan. Now you have 2 mortgages, that's worse than the original situation. You want the new. But in order to get the new, you have to pay off the old. And once you pay off the old, it has no claim on you anymore. If a couple months later, somebody from the bank at the old mortgage calls you up and they say, "Hey, you missed a payment," you tell them, "Listen, it has no effect on me anymore. I was talking to Sharon. I said, for me, I just tell them, hey, get lost. I know most of you are much nicer than I am, but I didn't realize how much nicer everybody in the world was than me until one day we're sitting around on the couch and I'm flicking through the channels and a rerun of Coach comes on. Did you ever watch that show? And I said to Sharon, he always says something outrageous or stupid. And I said to Sharon, you know why this is so funny? I said, because he's just saying what everybody else is thinking. And Sharon said to me, I got news for you. I said, yeah, what is it? She said, not everybody else is thinking that way. I said, oh. So I might respond in a different way than you, but the old mortgage has no claim on you anymore. You're under the new. It's the same thing with the law. When Jesus came, he said, listen, all these systems, they don't work anymore. The only covenant that was valid was the covenant of Moses, and nobody could keep that covenant. It was impossible. So what did Jesus do? He came here and he gave himself as a sacrifice for sin, but he could not be a valid sacrifice. He could not free us from the requirements of the law unless he fulfilled the entire law. Just like paying a mortgage, it's the same thing. He had never broken the law of Moses, and therefore he had a claim against the law of Moses. When he died, it was the payoff of the old and ushering in of the new. Because all the things that had happened just couldn't fit. Jesus didn't fit into it. That's what he's trying to tell these people, that all these external things that you're doing, they're not necessarily bad in and of themselves, but you can't earn a right relationship with God through these external acts. You can only have a right relationship with God through me. And I can't be contained in all these old things. God's plan simply cannot fit into man's religion. It just doesn't work. We had to have something new. God's plan is beyond anything that we could imagine or devise. And it's brought to us in the person of Jesus. You can't add Jesus to anything that's already existing. It's always him and him alone. He is the focus of the new covenant. He is the one who has completed all the requirements necessary for us to have a relationship with God. And we come to him in faith. And in faith, when we come to him, when we place our faith in him, his perfect work is credited to us, and we have a right relationship with God. It doesn't mean that we don't do good works. And Scripture tells us we're created for good works. That's not what gives us a right relationship with God. It's only Jesus. Our relationship is with God is based on him and him alone. So we go from this question about why do your disciples not fast? We discover that Jesus tells them, because I am the one, I am the bridegroom. I came here for my bride, the church. And while I am here with you, it's a time of rejoicing. But there will be a time when I will be taken away in a violent way. And when I do, my followers will be discouraged. But at the end of the day, I do all of that to bring you something that is incredibly invaluable. I come here so that you can have a relationship with my Father. That relationship is not because of your fasting and your diligence to a certain set of rules. It's because of the sacrifice that I'm going to make. I'm just always awestruck when I realize what Jesus has done. He's given us tremendous freedom, showed us unbelievable love. What he requires for us is to trust in him and to surrender to God, be obedient to him, to follow the leading of the Spirit of God. Let's pray.